Somewhere in a tunnel complex under the Isfahan region of central Iran sits roughly 440 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60%, a whisper away from weapons grade. And nobody outside Iran's own government can say for certain exactly where it is, whether it's still intact, or what Tehran actually intends to do with it. That single unresolved fact is doing more to keep this war alive than any single airstrike could. Here's the number that matters most. 440. 9 kilograms. That's the figure the International Atomic Energy Agency had on record before the strikes of June 2025, and it's the same figure the agency is still using today, because it hasn't been able to verify anything since. The IAEA's own reporting says it lost what it calls continuity of knowledge on Iran's stockpile the moment on-site cameras went dark, and it has described that gap as irreversible. Read that again. The world's nuclear watchdog isn't saying Iran might be hiding something. It's saying, in its own language, that it currently has no way to confirm the size, composition, or location of a stockpile that, at 90% enrichment, would be more than enough material for roughly 10 nuclear weapons by the agency's own yardstick. So where does the world actually think that material is sitting right now? Increasingly, the answer converges on Isfahan, IAEA. Director General Rafael Grossi has said publicly that he believes Iran's highly enriched uranium is still there, largely intact, sitting inside an underground tunnel complex that survived last year's strikes relatively undamaged, even while the above-ground enrichment halls at Natanz and Fordo were destroyed. Grossi has said his agency and outside observers tracking the site by satellite haven't seen movement that would suggest the material has been transferred elsewhere, which is about as close to an educated guess as anyone in his position is willing to offer. Separate satellite analysis published by the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists points to something more specific. Imagery from June 2025 appears to show a truck moving barrels consistent with overpacked, highly enriched uranium into the Isfahan tunnel complex, timed just before the strikes landed, suggesting Iran may have quietly relocated some or all of its most sensitive material to the one site that ended up surviving intact. If that reading is correct, it means Iran effectively moved its crown jewels out of the blast radius days before the biggest American bombing run in decades, and it means the facility now holding them has never once been inspected. That's not a small detail. Iran declared a new underground enrichment facility at Isfahan back in 2025. And as of the most recent IAEA reporting, inspectors still don't know whether centrifuges have ever been installed there, what its current operational status is, or whether it presently contains nuclear material at all. Iran has not granted the IAEA access to the site, has not disclosed its precise layout, and has effectively dared the rest of the world to simply trust that everything inside is exactly what Tehran says it is. Nobody in Vienna or Washington is inclined to take that on faith, and it's not hard to understand why. To understand how this specific standoff came to define the entire war, you have to go back to what actually happened in June of last year. Operation Midnight Hammer sent 7 B-2 Spirit stealth bombers from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri, carrying GBU-57 Massive Ordnance Penetrators, against Iran's declared nuclear sites at Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan. It was framed at the time as a decisive blow, and in a narrow sense it was. The above-ground enrichment infrastructure at Fordo and Natanz was badly damaged or destroyed. But a nuclear program isn't just centrifuge halls and support buildings. It's also whatever material had already been produced before the bombs fell, and that's precisely the piece nobody can account for now. The IAEA's own June 2026 Safeguards reporting states plainly that it cannot provide any information on the current size, composition, or location of Iran's enriched stockpile, and separately notes that 60% material was, at some point, stored at the Isfahan tunnel complex specifically. This is where Pickaxe Mountain enters the picture, and it's worth being precise about what that name actually refers to, because a lot of loose talk conflates several different things. The site, known by its Persian name Ku-e-Kolangazla, which does roughly translate to something like Pickaxe Mountain, sits near Natanz and was originally declared to the IAEA years ago as a facility intended to house centrifuge assembly capacity. Analysts at the Institute for Science and International Security have tracked ongoing construction there for years, and current assessments describe a complex buried deep into granite, a far denser and more penetration-resistant material than the softer rock at Fordo. Whether Iran's most sensitive uranium stockpile is actually stored there, at Isfahan, or split across multiple locations, remains genuinely unconfirmed. ISIS's own analysis is explicit on this point. The IAEA's reporting contains no confirmation of whether enriched uranium sits at Fordo's storage tunnels, at the newer Pickaxe Mountain facility, at an older tunnel complex near Natanz, or somewhere entirely undisclosed. Anyone telling you with total confidence exactly which mountain holds the material is speaking with more certainty than the actual evidence supports. What is confirmed is the political theater around all of it. President Trump has said publicly, in his own words, that Pickaxe Mountain will very probably be hit soon, and that there's nothing Iran can do about it. Iranian state media has responded with warnings that any strike on the facility would represent a full expansion of the war, language Tehran has used repeatedly since this conflict reignited without it, so far, translating into anything approaching the retaliation promised. That gap between rhetoric and outcome has become one of the more consistent patterns of this entire war. Big declarations on Iranian state television, followed by intercepted missiles over Kuwait and a drone or two brought down over Bahrain, rather than anything resembling the devastating response Tehran keeps threatening. There has been at least one moment where Iran's own diplomacy suggested a possible way out of this specific standoff. Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi told American media earlier this year that Iran was willing to dilute or downblend its enriched material to a lower purity level, framing it as a significant concession. On paper, that's exactly the kind of move that could defuse the uranium question entirely, turning weapons-usable material back into something far less concerning. In practice, it runs into the same wall as every other proposed solution. Verifying that any downblending actually happened would require the kind of IAEA access Iran has refused to grant for the better part of a year. A promise to dilute uranium that nobody is allowed to inspect isn't meaningfully different from the outside than no promise at all. That refusal to grant access sits at the center of what's actually driving this conflict's staying power. Iran maintains it isn't pursuing a weapon. But intelligence assessments compiled before the original strikes concluded that, with its expanded centrifuge capacity, Iran could theoretically produce enough weapons-grade material for multiple devices within a matter of days to weeks, if it ever made the deliberate decision to sprint toward weaponization. One conditional calculation published by the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists estimated that a modest cascade of a few hundred advanced centrifuges could take existing 60% material to weapons grade in roughly 10 days. A figure that comes with real caveats about whether Iran retains that specific centrifuge capacity intact, which nobody outside Tehran can currently confirm either. That breakout math is exactly why Washington isn't willing to simply let this stockpile sit unverified indefinitely. Every week that passes without inspectors getting real access is another week where the worst-case scenario stays technically on the table, regardless of what Iran's actual intentions are. Now, to the broader war, this uranium question sits inside, because it hasn't unfolded in isolation. A memorandum of understanding signed by Washington and Tehran earlier this year briefly suggested a real diplomatic off-ramp. Sanctions relief, a nominal reaffirmation from Iran that it wouldn't pursue weapons, oil markets calming as previously dark tankers came back online. That calm didn't last. Attacks on commercial shipping in the Strait of Hormuz in early July triggered a fresh round of American strikes, and from there, the campaign escalated night after night, eventually expanding into IRGC command infrastructure, missile and drone storage sites, and coastal defenses, while a naval blockade around Iranian ports went back into effect. Iran has continued firing back at shipping and at American positions in the Gulf throughout, and American officials, including Secretary of State Marco Rubio, have described the current doctrine bluntly. Whatever Iran spends on an attack, the American response is designed to cost more, without scaling down to match the size of what Iran did. Iran's oil exports, which sat above 2 million barrels a day before this phase of the conflict began, have collapsed under the renewed blockade, and independent estimates suggest the combined economic damage from the blockade runs into the hundreds of millions of dollars per day. Iran's currency has lost the overwhelming majority of its value. Inflation estimates run well into double digits by every serious tracking source, and the International Monetary Fund has projected a meaningful contraction in Iran's economy this year. Reports from inside the country describe protests from investors, healthcare workers, and retirees over unpaid wages and lost savings, met consistently with the same government response: arrests and crackdowns rather than negotiation. There have also been signs of friction inside the regime itself, with hardline factions reportedly criticizing the diplomatic track as a betrayal of the broader cause, which suggests the fractures here aren't only between the government and the public, but inside the leadership structure as well. Put those two pressures together, a military campaign that keeps expanding in scope, and an economy that's genuinely buckling, and you start to see why the uranium question has become as much a political weapon as a technical one. Iran's leadership is effectively boxed into a small number of unattractive choices. It can hand the material over as part of a verified settlement, which would require admitting exactly how much it has hidden and for how long, and which reporting suggests Iran's own leadership has been unwilling to do. It can leave the stockpile where it sits and gamble that depth, rock, and secrecy keep it out of reach of American penetrator weapons, a bet being made against an American weapons program that is actively working to close that exact gap. Or it can attempt to dilute the material unilaterally and simply assert that it happened, an approach nobody in Washington or Vienna is likely to accept without the kind of verified access Iran has spent the better part of a year refusing to grant. None of those paths resolve the standoff cleanly, and that, more than any single military calculation, is what's keeping this conflict from finding an obvious exit. There's also a wider regional dimension worth naming, honestly. Iran's allies have shown signs of trying to open secondary pressure points elsewhere. Reported threats from Houthi forces in Yemen against shipping through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the other major choke point vessels use when rerouting around the Arabian Peninsula, met by Saudi strikes on Houthi positions. There have also been reports, still unverified, of Russian assistance to Iran in the form of targeting support, a claim that fits a broader strategic logic even without confirmation. Any American attention and resources tied down in the Gulf is attention not going toward Ukraine. Domestically in the use, political appetite for this war is genuinely divided. Congress has continued funding the campaign even as a war powers resolution aimed at pulling back American involvement passed narrowly in the House before failing in the Senate, a sign that support for an open-ended commitment isn't universal even among the president's own allies. So what does the honest picture look like tonight? A stockpile of enriched uranium that the IAEA itself says it cannot locate or verify with confidence. A regime that has refused the access that would resolve the question either way. A military campaign that keeps widening in scope while an economy collapses under a blockade with no clear end date. And a leadership structure showing real internal strain, even as it keeps promising responses that so far haven't matched the scale of its rhetoric. If Pickaxe Mountain is eventually struck, the honest uncertainty doesn't disappear with it. Nobody can currently confirm whether the material sits there at all, whether it's already been moved somewhere untracked, or whether a strike would simply confirm what's already suspected, without ever settling the underlying question of where the rest of Iran's stockpile actually is. That's the trap sitting at the center of this war, and it's one built almost entirely out of decisions Tehran made itself. Keep the material. Don't disclose its location. Refuse the inspectors who could resolve the question either way.